Good evening again and welcome. Tonight we are going to continue our series of talks on the Dhammapada, which is one of the most popular and well-known of all of the books in the Buddhist sacred scriptures. It seems that human beings have a tendency to swing like a pendulum between one extreme and another. And one extreme that you often notice nowadays is an extreme point of view concerning the nature of religion. You get some people who say that all religions are wrong except one, and another group of people who say that all religions are the same. Now, when we say extremes, we don't necessarily mean something that's bad. I think the first of these two extremes is not bad in itself, but it often leads to much bad. Those who believe that their religion or their point of view, their ideology is right and all others are wrong, well, there have been lots of them through history, and much of the blood that has been spilt, with the best of intentions, in religious conflicts has normally done by those who cling to that extreme. And that has been very much the attitude that has dominated much of Western thought, not only religious thought. It has, since the decline of religion, it's quite often affected secular thinking as well. In the East, it's always been a little bit different. Asian culture has always tended to be more aware of subtle differences and similarities. And so, in Chinese culture, very rarely do you get people saying that all religions are the same, but they certainly often act as if they were basically the same. Discrimination and differences don't seem to be too important. If we can win the lottery by worshipping this god, so be it. But there are schools of thought which have developed, particularly in India, which in some schools of Hinduism, which have been really quite extreme from this point of view, in saying that all religions are just a different manifestation of the same truth. Now, once again, this extreme is not really very bad, and I can't think of any incidents in history, both recent past or in the distant past, where blood has been spilled because of this idea. Because the very nature of this idea that it tends to lead people to have a respect for all faiths, traditions and points of view. And that is certainly better than those who disparage all other points of view except their own. However, from a Buddhist point of view, it's still wrong because although it's better than the first extreme, it probably tends to obscure important differences and insights. If you believe that all religions are the same, it's very likely that you will gloss over their individual and unique contributions to human thought. You will just gloss it over by saying, well, that's a different way of saying the same thing as what we say in this, that, or the other religion. And, of course, probably the best evidence against this point of view is a good study of different religions. Now, you will hear people say, all religions teach us to be good. And I agree with that. I've yet to hear of any religions that say, thou shalt be bad. So it is true that probably all or most religions teach us to be good. But when we ask them what is good, well, then you start to see how difficult it is to maintain the belief that all religions are the same. In fact, the first thing that we notice when we look at the ideas of good and bad is how profoundly different they are, how uniquely different, even on very minor things. Take food. In Buddhism, there is no taboos concerning food, but most religions certainly do have some forms of taboos. You must eat no meat, or you must not eat certain types of meat. And just looking at two different religions, Islam and, say, Hinduism, just in this one minor matter, taboos concerning food, would it be possible to find religions so different? In one of the worst things that you could do would be to eat pork, whereas to eat beef would be quite acceptable, whereas in the other it's the exact reverse of that. Now some people will say, true, but behind that, behind those superficial differences, there are great similarities. They have a common theme. Unfortunately, people who don't belong to those particular religions tend to believe that. But if you say to a Muslim, eating pork is really not important, well, he will contradict you very, very quickly. For him, it is extremely important. If you say to a Hindu, eating beef, that's just a minor thing, that's not important, then he will contradict you very quickly. For him, it is fundamental. So we can only possibly say that all religions are the same if we ignore fundamental and very important differences that all religions seem to maintain. Now, when it comes to the fundamentals of religions, and that's what I'm going to have a look at it tonight, you see very interesting differences and also similarities. I'd like to have a look at some of the fundamental practices of different religions. And we'll have a look at, say, the Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition, and the Buddhist tradition. And we will see some very interesting similarities, but at the same time, some important differences that cannot be glossed over. In fact, what we're going to have a look in Buddhism is what is known as the 5 precepts, the Panchasila. Now, all Buddhists know about the 5 precepts. It's probably the basic Buddhist practice. To be a Buddhist, you have to follow, or at least sincerely try to follow, these principles. These are a unique and characteristic mark of all Buddhists. Now, if you have a look at the fundamental practices in other traditions, you see that they are very different. The Buddhists, sometimes you say that the 5 precepts are the equivalent of the 10 commandments in the Christian tradition. Now, I was brought up on the 10 commandments, but like most people, perhaps I've got an excuse for not knowing them now because I haven't been a Christian for many years. But I often meet Christians and I say to them, what are the 10 commandments? And they usually know 3 or 4. And it's probably a very good idea for everybody who is interested in religion, including those who are interested in their own religion, to have a good look at them. They're very important and they're absolutely fundamental. Okay. The first one is that you should have no God except God. Now that's very similar to a very important principle in Islam. And the second one is that you should make no statues, pictures, or images of God. And the third one is that you should never take God's name in vain. That is, when you drop something heavy on your foot and you say something rude using God's name, that you shouldn't do that. And the fourth one is that you should keep the Sabbath holy. That is Saturday, which is the last day of the week. Okay. That on that particular day, it's interesting, it says that you should do no work, but your servants and even foreigners, non-Christians or non-Jews who are living and working in your house, they should have that day as a day of rest also. Okay? Then you should honour your mother and father. That's number 5. Then you should not murder. You should not commit adultery. You should not steal. You should not bear false witness. Now this means that when there is a court of law or an inquiry, you shouldn't go up and tell lies within that court of inquiry. And the last one, which to me has a bit of a Buddhist ring about it, is that you should not covet your neighbour's wife or his pig, goat or donkey. Okay. That is, that within your heart, it's not that you should not commit adultery with your neighbour's husband or wife or steal his pig or donkey. You should not even have those thoughts. You should not have covetous thoughts about theft. Okay. Now these are the fundamentals of Christian ethics and Christian practice. Okay? Christian belief is something different, but Christian practice, this would be fundamental. And I was speaking to a Muslim friend, and I asked him, what would you say would be the fundamental practices in Islam? And he said it would be the 5 pillars of Islam. And I've heard of them before from time to time, but I've never actually sort of taken much note, and we discussed them, and he told me what they mean. And to be a Muslim, any Muslim over 14 is obliged to behave in this particular way, to practice these particular things. And the first one, I was very interested to see that the actual Arabic word, I'm not really sure whether it is related to the Pali word, but it looks remarkably similar, and it has the same meaning. The first one is the profession of faith. That is, that all Muslims have to believe and actually say, I believe that there is no God but God, and that he has only one prophet, the Prophet Muhammad. And this is called the Saddha, which sounds very much like Saddha, which is the Buddhist word for faith. So this is the first one, the profession of faith. And the second one is Zalat, which means worship. A Muslim at specific times of the day, he or she has to bow in a particular way, has to carry out these particular practices. And then the third one is Zakat, which is almsgiving. A certain percentage of every Muslim's wage, his income, should be put aside for those in the community who are not as financially stable and secure as he is. Okay. The fourth one is probably one that most people would know, Hajj, which is at least once in one's life one has to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. And the last one is fasting. At certain times of the year, in fact at this time of the year, your Muslim neighbours would be fasting from sunrise to sunset, taking no food and no water. And you could understand the spiritual value of something like this. Even in a country like this, that would be quite a sacrifice. Could you imagine in the Saudi Arabian deserts, where the temperatures are very extreme, from sunrise to sunset for several months, taking no food or no water throughout the day? Now, apparently, these are the 5 pillars of Islam, which all schools of Islam agree with. Some schools of Islam add a 6th pillar, which is jihad, which is to go to war to promote the faith. Okay? Now, if we have, this would be the basic practices of Christianity, the basic practices of Islam, and we would have to say that the basic practices of Buddhism are what is called the 5 precepts. Okay? And if you look in the Dhammapada, and indeed in all Buddhist scriptures, there is a constant reference to these 5 precepts. If we look at verse 246 and 247 in the Dhammapada, it says this: Yopanang atipateti musavadancha basati lokeya dinangadiyanti paradancha gacchati surameraya panancha yonaro anuyujati iddeva mesolo lokasmin mulankanatiyatanu. Whoever in this world kills living beings, tells lies, takes what is not given, or takes another person's spouse, that is, commits adultery, or who drinks intoxicants, that person undermines his or her foundations in the world. Now, so fundamental are these practices in Buddhism that it is said that even if you've taken refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, but if you do not sincerely try to practice these, you can't, in all honesty, call yourself a Buddhist. Now, here we see some similarities with other religious traditions and some differences. Now, if you look at the 10 Commandments, it would seem to me that you have most of the Buddhist precepts, except the last one, intoxicating drinks, only there's a slight difference. So the first precept in Buddhism is not to kill any living being. Okay. In the Old Testament, the precept, the commandment, the sixth commandment, is that you should not murder. Okay. In other words, this is rather narrow. It refers exclusively to human beings. And in fact, scholars have suggested, probably quite correctly, that in the beginning it didn't even refer to human beings. It actually meant you don't kill a member of the Hebraic tribe. Samaritans, Sumerians, you can bump them off as much as you like. You don't kill a member of your own tribe. But whatever it may have been originally, certainly for many centuries, it has come to mean you don't kill any human being. In Buddhism, it's a bit broader than that. It's expanded to all human beings. You don't commit adultery, the seventh commandment. This is, once again, it's a little more narrow than the Buddhist commandment. The third precept in Buddhism, that you should not commit sexual misconduct. Okay? And to commit adultery means that you have sexual relations while you are married or with the spouse of somebody else. Whereas sexual misconduct refers to any sexual exploitation of others, whether they are your spouse or not, whether you are married or not. But fundamentally it's basically the same. The eighth commandment is that you should not steal, which is basically the same as the second precept in Buddhism. The ninth commandment is that you should not bear false witness, which is basically the same as the fourth precept, that you should not lie. Okay. But then we have some others which are obviously far more important because they head the list. Certainly, somebody who's following the 10 Commandments would strive very hard not to kill, steal, lie, etc. But far more important than that are the first several. These are what specifically makes the 10 Commandments specifically Jewish or Christian. No God but God. No statues of God. No taking God's name in vain. And keeping the Sabbath holy, or not working on the Sabbath. Now, here we come to a very important difference. I would say that in the Buddhist tradition, the fundamental practices are purely ethical. Whereas in many other religious traditions, their idea of good and bad is not always ethical. Sometimes it is very difficult to understand exactly why this should be considered good or bad. So if you take, for example, the fourth commandment. Now, if you actually think about it, the fourth commandment is probably an extremely important commandment. Okay. It is probably the first time in history, because it's a very old commandment, the first time in history that a society has said that we have any records of people saying that everybody should have a holiday at least once a week. Now, the social significance of this, the social impact of this, is hard to underestimate. And I was looking in the Old Testament, it says, not only you, if you're a Jew and you're a Christian, you take Saturday off, or nowadays Sunday, they've changed it. You take it off, but your animals should not be worked either. If you have a slave or a servant who is of a different religion, you've got to give them the day off too. In other words, everybody has a time for rest, at least once in 7 days. Now that is probably a commandment of not only great significance, but it has a very humane idea behind it. Okay? However, looking at it from another point of view, it's probably very good to do this. But is it unethical not to do it? It might be humane to give everybody a holiday once a week. It might be good as a social practice. But is it immoral if you don't do it? So I was thinking about how useful and how important this was, and then I looked a little bit further on, and goodness me, we have another commandment. If you do work on the Sabbath, you have to be executed. So here we see we have moved from ethics to some sort of ancient and traditional taboo. Okay. Now if we look at, say, the second of the commandments, here it says that the first one is perhaps a very important one. You only have one God. And then you make no statues of God. Now, once again, I could see the value of this. When people have statues, they tend to start thinking that the statues are the God. Okay? It's common enough in Buddhism. We know that a Buddha Rupa, a statue of the Buddha, is made out of metal, melted down doorknobs, or whatever it happens to be, clay. Okay? And yet, you often hear people say that you shouldn't put the Buddha statue on the shrine in this way, or you shouldn't wash it, or it shouldn't be facing the toilet because if the Buddha looks out into the toilet he might get upset. Or, in other words, people start treating the symbol of the deity or the teacher as if it were the deity or the teacher. So it probably is not a bad idea. You can see the value of not having statues. However, is it so terrible if people were to do so? So it seems once again this has gone beyond ethics into some sort of superstitious taboo. Now if you look at the 5 precepts, and indeed all Buddhist morality, it seems to be, from what I can see, completely free from superstition and taboo. Every one of the precepts is universally applicable. Some people may feel that making statues is tremendously evil, or working on Sunday is tremendously evil, or by facing in another direction by praying that this is tremendously evil. But there would be undoubtedly others who would think, oh, what's so bad about that? What possible harm can come from this? How can this be unethical? But if you look at the 5 precepts, it would be difficult to think like that. It seems that the Buddha has tried, in his wisdom, to give us a fundamental guide to behaviour that would be universally applicable. You could add more to it, but you couldn't take anything away from it. If you took something away from it, there would be a lack of guidance as far as people's ethical behaviour is concerned. And the reason for this is because whereas in other traditions, many of the basic principles as far as how to behave and far as to act were certainly based on social concerns, on ethical ideas, but also on superstitions, taboos, ancient ideas of right and wrong. That would be not so in the case of Buddhism. In fact, we know, we've discussed this before, that Buddhist ethical ideals are not based on any ancient taboos. They are based on several clearly defined and easily understandable principles. The first of these would be what you might call the consequential principle. That we could judge a thing as wholesome or unwholesome according to the consequences it has. So if we take, for example, the fifth precept. In Western countries, many Western Buddhists are rather lax about this precept. Because as soon as they hear that one of the precepts in Buddhism is that you should not take alcohol, they immediately react according to the conditioning that they've had in their society. Not in Western society now, but 50 or 100 years ago, the religious institutions in our society used to be very domineering. And in fact, in our country, we used to call them, we still have an old word for it, wowsers. A wowser is somebody who can't stand seeing somebody else enjoy themselves. So people tend to feel that people were against alcohol, not because sometimes you become alcoholic or sometimes you hurt yourself when you're intoxicated, but rather you might enjoy yourself. And if there's one thing we can't stand, it's seeing people enjoy themselves. So when they hear about Buddhism, that in Buddhism you should not drink, they immediately think that there are moral reasons, or they immediately think of the old reasons that they used to be given us for not to drink. But in Buddhism it's entirely different. What's wrong with alcohol? In itself, nothing. It's a type of a fluid with certain chemicals in it. But we do know that it does have a profound effect upon the mind. In other words, the consequences of it can be quite detrimental. If you're trying to guard your behavior, if you're trying to purify your mind, few things could be more detrimental than alcohol. The consequences of it we wish to avoid. If only it could be that they could create all these delicious types of alcohol without any intoxicating ingredients in it, by all means, drink. Drink yourself stupid. In fact, I believe that they've actually done that nowadays, and it's probably a wonderful thing. They now have non-alcoholic champagne. I got some only recently. Not bad at all. And I can drink it, because it has no detrimental consequences, except that you have to go to the toilet a bit more than you did before. Yeah? So, we're not interested in what God said or what the ancients did or what our ancestors said in ancient taboos or anything like that. We look at behavior, certain forms of action, and if the consequences seem to be negative, we will avoid it. And indeed, in the Dhammapada itself, the Buddha says in verse 67 and 68, an action which, having been done, leads to tears and weeping, that is ill done. An action which, having been done, does not lead to tears, which leads to delight and happiness, that is well done. In other words, here the Buddha is saying is that we can judge an action by the consequences of it. If having done something, you seem that your life becomes more complex, more complicated, you harm others, you harm yourself, we can say that that action is wrong. If it leads to simplifying of your life, degree of happiness, we could say that it is right. And more important than that, what we call sometimes the universalizability principle, that how we can get a very good idea as whether an action is right or wrong, good or bad, ethical or not, is by being sensitive to our own feelings, our own needs and our own wants, and simply by transferring those to others. In other words, if I wouldn't mind people doing that to me, I won't hesitate doing that to others. Or, obversely, if I wouldn't like others to do that to me, I won't do that to others. And once again, in the Dhammapada, the Buddha talks about this same principle in slightly different words. In verse 130, for example, he says, all tremble at the rod. Life is dear to all. Put yourself in the place of another, and then kill none, nor have them killed. And the important line there is attanang upamang katva. Put yourself in the place of another. Now here we understand why in Buddhism the first precept does not only just apply to human beings, it also applies to animals. We wouldn't like people to pull our tail if we had one, so we don't pull the tails of others. We wouldn't like people to remove one of our limbs or whatever. We wouldn't do that to others, not just other human beings, other members of the tribe, to any being. Okay? The most important foundation of Buddhist ethical behaviour. Attanang upamang katva. Put yourself in the place of another. Put yourself in the place of others. Transfer to others the thoughts, the feelings and the wishes you have towards yourself. Indeed, in the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha puts it even more nicely. Yatha ahang tata ete. Yatha ete tata ahang. As am I, so are others. As are others, so am I. We are one family, one brotherhood of living beings who have very similar feelings, very similar nerves. Pain affects us just the same way as it affects others. Certain forms of behaviour give joy to others just as they give to us. So not wanting certain things done to us, we do not do that to others. And this is one of the soundest guides to ethical behaviour. So Buddhist ethical behaviour, the basic foundations of Buddhist behaviour, is not based on any taboos, ancient ideas, superstitions. It's based on very simple, very sound principles. Now, if you look at the 5 precepts, one thing about the precepts is that almost everybody knows the 5 precepts. Almost anybody who is a Buddhist knows the 5 precepts. Many people indeed know them by heart. However, I think that sometimes the precepts are like some other things, like some beautiful pieces of music. When we first hear it, it gives us tremendous joy. If we hear it too frequently, we become deaf to the beauty of it. Okay? And I think that the precepts are like that. Very frequently we hear about them, we think about them so much that after a while we sort of become deaf to the meaning. So sometimes it's quite important to be reminded of what they are and what they really mean. The first precept is Panatipata Veramani Sikkhapadang Samadhiyami. And as soon as we see this, immediately we see a difference not only in the contents of the precepts as opposed to, say, the 5 pillars of Islam or the 10 commandments, but difference in the spirit too. Commandments are exactly that. There's no discussion needed. There's no thought needed. I command you to do that, and that's all that has to be done. In the Buddhist precepts, we don't have commandments, we have sikkhapadang, precepts of training. In other words, we practice them not because God said so or because the Buddha said so, but because we have been told by the Buddha, and our experience tells us, that these are very helpful for training. For training what? For training us to help out to develop our mind in a particular direction. Panatipata Veramani Sikkhapadang Samadhiyami. I take the precept not to harm. Pana. Pana is like the Sanskrit word prana, which means breath. We have also in Buddhism anapanasati. So it literally means I won't harm in the process of training. As a training, I won't harm anything that breathes. not I won't kill, I won't harm. To pull a cat's tail or to do something cruel or unkind to an animal is as much breaking the precepts as to kill it. Adinna dana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami. Dana is to give, adinna dana is to take. So I won't take anything that belongs to others. Kamesu micchāchāra veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami. Kama means pleasure. I won't go the wrong way in order to experience pleasure. Now, karma means any sort of pleasure. Pleasure from the ear, pleasure from the eye, pleasure from the nose, pleasure from the tactile sensation on the body. So if you do something which creates delight or pleasure for yourself, while creating difficulty, hardship, or humiliation for another, that would be breaking the precept. So, for example, if you ridicule somebody, if you hold them up to ridicule so that others laugh at them, others enjoy themselves immensely, while the person being laughed at feels cut to the wick, humiliated, then that would be breaking the precept. It's very hard to avoid this, but if you were to see somebody doing something and they slip over on a banana peel and you laugh, it was very difficult not to do that. But if you do that, in a sense, that is, you have derived pleasure from the inconvenience or the harm of another. But while karma means any form of pleasure, usually it is used in the more narrow sense to mean sexual pleasure. So if we derive sexual pleasure by exploiting, cheating, forcing others, then that would be breaking the precept. So this has got nothing to do with marriage or divorce or anything like that, whether the person is your spouse or not, whether you are married or not. If you derive pleasure from another at their expense, without full compliance from them, then that is breaking the third precept. Musavada veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami. I take the precept to avoid lying. Okay? And finally, suramerya majja pamadatthana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami. I take the precept to avoid intoxicants which cloud the mind. Now, if you have a look at all of these, if you look at, say, the 10 commandments, we can see that some of those obviously have a social significance. They will have an impact upon the mind. But let's say you decide to take a holiday on Wednesday instead of on the Sabbath. Would that be wrong? It would seem to me not to make much difference. But of course, once again, when we're talking about other people's religion, to them that is very significant. In fact, even in my own country, and I know now that presently in England they're having a bit of a stink. The stink is that all the shops want to open on Sunday, which is now the Sabbath. And powerful religious bodies are trying to prevent this from being done. Why? Well, they can give quite good rationalizations. But if the government was to say, well, okay, we'll give everybody a rest on Wednesday instead of Sunday, they probably wouldn't like that. We don't know why the seventh day has to be kept sacred. It's just some ancient taboo, which certainly having one day of rest a week is an excellent idea. But why the Sabbath? We can't really give a good reason for that. But if you look at the 5 precepts, a good reason, a sound reason, a solid reason can be given for every one of these. They have nothing to do with taboos. The first precept. I wouldn't like others to kill me, I won't kill them. It's as simple as that. And if I do kill, What impact does that have upon me? We know what impact it has upon the others. The fellow gets killed. What impact does it have upon me? It makes me perhaps a little more callous. Certainly it was due to anger, irritation or annoyance, and therefore by giving in to those feelings to the degree that I would kill another, it can only strengthen those states of mind. In other words, I suffer, the other suffers. Stealing. I wouldn't like anybody to steal from me. I won't do that to them. And if I do steal, why do I steal? It's because of greed or a lack of respect for the property of others. And therefore, if I give in to those feelings to the degree that I steal, that can only mean that it has strengthened those negative attitudes and feelings within my mind. I won't sexually exploit others because I wouldn't like anybody to do that to me. And if I were to do it, it makes me callous and thoughtless concerning the needs and the feelings of others. Nothing could be worse than being lied to. No, that's not true. It's okay to be lied to as long as you never find out that you've been taken for a chump. But if you found out that the person who spoke to you and who you trusted has actually lied to you, then the whole relationship of trust, which is so important in human relationships, starts to break down. If somebody has lied to you about something very important or significant, you find it very difficult to trust them again. There will always be doubt. We don't like others to do it to us, we don't do it to them. And in the case of intoxicants, this tends to have more of an effect upon us than others. But it does have an effect upon others too. Several years ago I was in Australia and I was sitting in the temple all day with nothing to do, just meditating, watching the people go by, and every now and then somebody would come to the door. And one afternoon a man came to the door and I let him in, and he was drunk. In fact, he was very drunk. So I didn't really want to make a scene, because sometimes drunks can get quite troublesome. So I sat him down, and nothing could be worse about trying to talk about something important to somebody who's sort of dribbling. And anyway, we talked for a while and I tried to get rid of him as soon as I could. And I managed to do that. And I pushed him out the door gently, and as he went down the path and opened the gate, I was overcome by a very strong feeling of sorrow. Not sorrow that he might fall over and hit his head or anything like that, or that he looked so sort of lonely and woe-begone. But I thought, isn't it a shame? I'll probably never see him again, and indeed I didn't. Now here are two people. We've come together, and we may never come together again. I could share nothing with him, and in the brief time that we were together, he could share nothing with me. Our parting was of no value in any way whatsoever, because of his ability to comprehend was deadened by alcohol. So this to me is one of the reasons why any form of intoxication is unnecessary. It makes the preciousness of being able to communicate with another very difficult. So he staggered off down the path, learning nothing about Buddhism, and in my case I was able to find out nothing really sensible about him or useful about him. Who knows? Our meeting could have been, under different circumstances, of great significance to me or to him, but it was not to be because of alcohol. I think that's very sad. So, and of course, quite apart from this, we vomit all over ourselves and drive our car in a dangerous way. We tend to become violent if we drink too much. So, there is very good practical reasons for avoiding these things. I don't kill. On the contrary, I try to develop a respect for life. I don't steal. I try to develop a respect for other people's belongings, their property. I don't sexually exploit others. I try to develop a respect for their dignity and their freedom to choose. I don't lie to others. I respect their right to be told the truth. And I don't take alcohol because that will allow me and them to communicate at a higher level. Now, this is the reason why these basic practices in Buddhism probably in some ways certainly distinguish Buddhism from other religions. We see similarities, but we see important and fundamental differences, things that make each of the religions unique and different. And before we finish, there's one other thing I want to talk about concerning the precepts, and which is sometimes not mentioned. As soon as we talk about the precepts, people start asking questions like, now if I did this and that happened and then blah, 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 then would it be right? Or on the other hand, if I did this but then that was like this, but he went over here and he did that, would that be right? I don't know how they're able to sort of think up these very complicated situations. Is it all right to kill mosquitoes and so on? The details one has to work out, and indeed will work out for oneself. If there is sincerity and mindfulness, you will practice the precepts to the best of your ability. But the precepts are not only how we should act, there's something else also. It's about how we should apply these precepts. And it seems to me that very frequently we fall into some other extremes. And these two extremes are over-scrupulousness and laxity. And people may fall into these extremes according to their individual nature. I've noticed, for example, in Westerners, they tend to be a bit lax, whereas Asian Buddhists tend to be, when they're sincere Buddhists, tend to be extremely scrupulous. And neither of these are good. Some people take the precepts and it's not a source of happiness or anything for them. On the contrary, it immediately becomes a source of great anxiety. They become like a man walking on a tightrope or somebody trying to tiptoe across thin ice. They're conscious, they are uncomfortably conscious of every thought, every action. They're agonizing over whether this particular action will break the precepts or not. I've told you before, but I'll tell you again, a friend of mine, he would never take honey because the honey has been removed from the bees without asking their permission. Therefore, if you take honey, you're breaking the second precept, you're stealing. Okay? So, far from uncomplicating your life and enabling you to move through life or wing through life easier than before, when you're over-scrupulous, it complicates and gives rise to a lot of anxiety, and that is a mistake. On the other hand, some people, and this is certainly common, particularly in some Western countries, where people tend to think that the precepts are not really very important. And I will tell you quite honestly, one discovers that Westerners in the Tibetan tradition, and I've discovered particularly in what's known as the Kagyu tradition, tend to be very much like this. They tend to think that they've got some sort of esoteric teaching, they've got a very highly developed, perhaps even an enlightened teacher. And of course, when we've got an enlightened teacher in a very exclusive club of Buddhists who are practicing the higher teachings, well, we don't have to worry about things like the precepts. This is for the kids, the Hinayanas, the poor old Theravadins, pretty dull, boring sort of thing. And we are far beyond that. We don't need those precepts anymore. If we want to drink, we will, because we're adults. If we want to have a bit of a sex orgy, which apparently is quite common in some of those traditions, then we will do that. And the results have proved to be absolutely disastrous. In the United States recently, there was a tremendous and a most unfortunate scandal for years and years and years, the precepts were ignored because people thought that they were just a bit too smart, a bit too spiritually developed. And it's very interesting to notice that in the United States there have been recently several quite unpleasant scandals in the Buddhist community, in the Zen community, in the Tibetan, particularly the Kagyu community. But so far, those boring old Theravadins who plod away and very carefully make an effort to practice the 5 precepts, no scandals there yet. And I think that there is something very important to be learnt from that. That as soon as you start compromising on these most basic Buddhist principles, problems can, and indeed have, arisen. Anything less than the 5 precepts, and you're courting with disaster. Everybody who's a sincere Buddhist, and in particularly those who are in a position of being a teacher, have to do their very best to practice these with great diligence and sincerity. And the Buddha was aware of this. In one of his discourses, he says, "Some people here, on being told by me, 'Give this up,' they think, 'But what is this trifle, insignificant matter? The teacher lays too much emphasis on such small things.' Then they do not give up that thing, and they cause dissatisfaction to be nursed against me and against those who do desire the training. And because of this, it becomes a strong bond, a stout bond, a solid bond, a bond that does not rot away like a thick log of wood." So apparently even at his time, people would come to him, "Venerable Sir, I want a meditation subject, and I want this, and I want that, and I want enlightenment, and I want this special empowerment, and I want this." And the Buddha would say, "Well, you start by practicing the precepts." "Oh, yes, I know about that, but what about the..." No, this is very fundamental. It is not a small and insignificant thing. It is, in fact, as it says in the Dhammapada, it's the foundation, the mula, in the
beginning of death. Death is the beginning of birth. Between birth and death, suffering is more than happiness. Through Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum. Birth is the beginning of death. Death is the beginning of birth. Between birth and death, suffering is more than happiness. Through Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, where we can find true happiness and enlightenment. Thus one should observe and realize that all the world phenomena and ideas are like an image of a world phenomena, and ideas are impermanent, like water bubbles, like food and lightning. Om Mani Padme Hum. 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 Birth is the beginning of death. Death is the beginning of birth.
Between birth and death, suffering is more than happiness.
Through Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. Where we can find true happiness and enlightenment. Thus one should observe and realize that all the world phenomena and ideas are unreal, like a dream, like magic, and like an image. All the world phenomena and ideas are impermanent, like water bubbles, like dew and lightning. Om Mani Padme Hum. 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 Live by the Dharma, lift up your spirit, be one with Sangha, be like the dewdrop that slips into the great shining sea. Lift up your mind and be free. Let's all be one in the Lord. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. Leave all your worries and your desires. Live for your brothers and for your neighbors. Be like the dewdrop that slips into the great shining sea. Let's all be one in the Lord. Love is the way of the Lord. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. What good is it to live in greed? It only yields hundredfold tears. Free your mind from misery. Love is the ultimate key. Let's all be one in the Lord. Love is the way of the Lord. True love is giving without remembering. Love is compassion with no distinctions. Love is the way of the Lord. Follow the path of the Lord. Lift up your mind and be free. Let's all be one in the Lord. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. What good is